Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Giles, Federal Labor's Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, welcoming all of you to this, our third called media press conference. As you'd appreciate, these have all been virtual press conferences, and it may be that way for some time. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which all of us gathered together virtually on, and also particularly acknowledge my friend and colleague, the Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who is the real attraction to this conversation, sharing his critical perspective on those most important debates at the moment, beyond health, to what is happening with the economy and could be happening to safeguard Australia's economic future. Before I throw to Jim, I was just going to make a couple of brief remarks myself. Firstly, to acknowledge the interest of so many multicultural media organisations in this process, and to say thank you for your engagement, and to say that for Federal Labor, this is something that we really value, and we value it as a dialogue. So while these events every fortnight or so are important, we'd encourage you to engage with myself, with Kristina, with other shadow ministers on the issues that are so important to your readers, viewers and listeners. We need to hear what matters to them through your eyes if we are to do our bit to recognise our engagement with a modern multicultural society. That's particularly so in the context of coronavirus, and perhaps especially so, Jim won't mind me saying, I think, for those of us who are based in Melbourne as we deal with stage 4 restrictions, which impact so significantly on everyone, but are particularly challenging in communities where English is not a first language, where their engagement with you guys as media providers, trusted community leaders, is so critical. From the get-go in Federal Labor, we've been calling for greater attention to engagement with the full diversity of Australia through translation and through engaging with organisations such as yours as well. We've been disappointed that more hasn't been done, but we'll continue to push. With that in mind, can I hope that everyone has been staying safe and hand over to my friend Dr. Jim Chalmers, Labor's Shadow Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for the introduction, but most of all for the opportunity to speak to so many friends from multicultural media from around Australia. This is a really good way to go about it, I think. So really to pay tribute to you and all of the tireless work that you do in our cold communities around Australia. Thank you very much for that, and to Senator Keneally's office as well. I acknowledge the Yugambeh and the Yuggera people. I'm coming to you from Logan City, just south of Brisbane, which, as Andrew and many of you probably know, is one of, if not the most multicultural part of Queensland. And it's a real honour to represent so many cold communities from around the world here in my part of the world. And from here to you, Andrew, and to everyone in Victoria going through, an extraordinarily difficult time. We send you strength and solidarity. These restrictions are obviously extraordinarily difficult, but also at the same time extraordinarily important to limiting the spread of this diabolical virus, which is doing so much damage to our health and to our communities and our economy as well. My job in Anthony Albanese's team is to focus exclusively on the economy, and so I thought I might do that today in some opening remarks. And I thought I'd focus on two things, one in a bit of detail and one in a bit less detail, and then really looking forward to any questions that people might have. And the issue I wanted to talk about in some detail was paid pandemic leave. I wanted to touch on JobKeeper as well after that. But before we get there, I think we should acknowledge that the government has now updated their expectations for the economy. And as all of you know, and all of our communities know, we're going through an incredibly difficult period that is going to get worse in the economy before it gets better. We do have an issue with rising unemployment. We do have a concern that high unemployment will be with us for some time yet. And so all of the policies that we have, all of the work that Andrew and I and the Labor team under Anthony Albanese are doing is about trying to make sure that we can get the government to do the right thing by people who have either lost their job or at their risk, or they are at risk of losing their job. That's the most important task for us in the economy. And when it comes to those two policy areas that I mentioned, first of all, paid pandemic leave, there's a real issue, as many of you know, in If you take Victoria, for example, as Premier Andrews, who's doing a terrific job in my view, he pointed out that something like 80% of the transmission in Victoria has been at the workplace level. And what that means is that people are going to work when they might have some symptoms, and unfortunately that is contributing to the spread of the virus. And what we say in the Labor Party is that nobody should have to choose in the morning before you go to work or at night between doing the right thing, feeding your family, earning a living, and doing the right thing by your co-workers, staying away if you're sick. And so we've actually been saying for 5 months now, since the beginning of March, that we need a national system of paid pandemic leave so that people aren't faced with that horrible choice. People who might be sick and have no choice but to go to work because they need to provide for their loved ones. We want to make sure that they stay home and limit the spread of the virus. So we've said for some time the national government should step in and provide some paid pandemic leave to complement and supplement some of the programs that are already in place, whether it be the state government in Victoria. Some big employers are providing it, and in aged care it's happening too. And so really that's been our big priority this week. The government has come out and said that they will provide a payment, quite a limited payment, Victoria only, and not applying from the federal perspective to temporary visa holders. The state government has had to come in and provide that payment for temporary visa holders, which is disappointing that the federal government did not consider that to be a priority. And so that's what's happened in the last 24 hours or so. The government has made that announcement. We have said that that's a welcome step, but it doesn't go far enough. And the reason we've said that is because it's not enough to come in after there's been the kind of transmission that there's been in Victoria and to come in with kind of a half a system of payment for people to stay home if they're sick. We need it to be a national system. We need to prevent the spread of this virus, and that means providing it nationally and doing it properly, including to people who have temporary visas. So paid pandemic leave is absolutely crucial to getting on top of this virus, and we support it wholeheartedly. We would have liked the government to have gone further. That's the first issue. The second issue is the JobKeeper program, which many, if not all of you, would be familiar with. JobKeeper is a very good idea, a very important program, but there are too many holes in it. And one of the most obvious holes, obviously, has been temporary visa holders have been excluded from the program. And that's created some big difficulties, I think, in our workforces and in our communities. But more broadly, the government has announced that they will taper JobKeeper away and that they will apply a new test to businesses. If the economy was recovering strongly, that would make sense. But what we've seen, particularly in Victoria, but not just Victoria, is that the economy has deteriorated since they announced the new arrangements for JobKeeper. And so what we've said, and Anthony Albanese has said it in the last day or two, as have I and others, is that the government should be reconsidering the JobKeeper rate and the tapering away and the retesting of businesses to make sure that we don't have the economic carnage that would be the consequence of some of these new necessary restrictions. So those are the two issues I thought I'd cover off in the introduction, Andrew, but obviously happy to take any questions or to add to anything or supplement anything that I've said already.
Look, thanks very much, Jim. That was terrific. And as we move to questions, there are a couple which have been pre-registered, but I'd remind all participants that they can use the Q&A function to direct questions either to Jim or to myself. The first question we have got registered is from the good people of SBS, and Jim, they'd like you to reflect on the extent to which governments, both state and federal, have done enough to specifically support called communities through this pandemic, financially as well as in terms of health.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the friends at SBS, not just for the question, but really for the incredibly important in-language work that you're doing, I know here, but right around Australia. Thank you for that. In terms of support for called communities, I think there have been some significant gaps, and they do concern us greatly in the Labor Party. I mentioned the JobKeeper exclusion, which has been very problematic. A lot of my constituent work goes to that exclusion and the issues that cascade from temporary visa holders being excluded from JobKeeper. Clearly, we're disappointed that the Morrison government didn't include, even in the limited paid pandemic scheme that they announced late yesterday, they didn't see temporary visa holders as enough of a priority to make it a federally funded system. And so I'm pleased that the Andrews government has stepped in and done the right thing. In my view, it shouldn't have taken that for the right thing to be done. The third broad area of concern that has troubled us, and we have spoken about publicly, is that there is a large cohort of international students who have been left behind in the various types of support that the federal government is otherwise providing. And you can imagine, particularly in the big cities, but not just there, there is a group of international students who, for one reason or another, might not have been able to get back to their country of origin. Their part-time or work might have dried up to some extent, and they're having real difficulty supporting themselves. So there are areas of concern. We want to make sure that cold communities aren't left out and left behind in this recession. They are such an important part of our economy, and we think that they deserve to be treated better than they have been.
Thanks very much, Jim. And that's a terrific segue to the next question, which is from Sameway Magazine in Melbourne. And the proposition that they've asked me to respond to is, should there be a called specific distribution out focused on COVID communications? And I think this is a really important idea, and one that we are definitely exploring in federal Labor. We have been concerned at a number of information failures when it comes to communicating in language specifically, and we've still seen examples of poor translation, particularly in Arabic and in simplified Chinese, that we think could be addressed if we did more to bring together the expertise that's on this call, but more broadly in called media. And that's why Senator Keneally and I proposed that the federal government fund some called COVID communication grants to incentivise all publishers, to incentivise community leaders to come together to make sure that we are delivering not the right message, but the right message to be received by the right audience. We know that some communities have been particularly impacted by COVID, and we haven't got the communications right. So that's something that we will look further at, and hopefully we can build dialogue on. And I guess there's another question from Il Globo in Melbourne, a publication that I'm very familiar with, and I think it's really addressed to both of us, Jim. So I might throw it to you in the first instance, and it really highlights for Labor whether it's important for us to articulate a clear political strategy that goes to responsibilities for issues in aged care and to prompt a federal government response. So you might start and I'll finish if that's okay, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. I mean, the three priorities, I mentioned two of them before, but when Anthony Albanese laid out the priorities for this week, he said JobKeeper, paid pandemic leave, and then aged care, really a very pressing issue. And I've described it as a horror show in many ways, because there is a lot of fear in aged care, in aged care homes about the spread of the virus, but also things that are very easy to understand, like the inability to have visitors, the consequences of the lockdown. And so there's a lot of fear and a lot of trepidation in aged care at the moment. We need to respond to that. We also need to recognise that aged care has been a difficult issue, not just because of the coronavirus, but for some time before that. We have an aged care Royal Commission at the moment for that reason, because of the horrific stories that we've heard. And what we say you asked about our political strategy. The most important thing that we can see here is for the Prime Minister, Mr. Morrison, to actually take responsibility for the problems in aged care. It is a Commonwealth responsibility. It is time he stopped pretending it was somebody else's job to look after aged care. We've made some very constructive suggestions about applying the crisis arrangements that have now been applied in Victoria to other states. We've said that the government should respond to the interim recommendations of the Royal Commission, things like getting under 65s out of aged care, dealing with the home care waiting lists, reducing the reliance on chemical and physical restraints in these places. There's so many important things that the government needs to be doing to clean up aged care, but for that to happen, the Prime Minister has to take political responsibility for it. The buck stops with him. We'll continue to make suggestions about how the system can be improved, but at the end of the day, we need to see action from the government sooner rather than later, because in so many ways, these places are the epicentre of what concerns us most about this virus.
Thanks very much, Jim. We've got a related question from the Barat Times, so I might just add to Jim's answer and reflect particularly to a Globo that I know that so many members of the Italian community are concerned about what's happened at Epping Gardens in my electorate, and I extend my deepest sympathy and my resolve to get to the bottom of what has happened there and to reassure family members in the future. But Jim very effectively articulated what is our strategy and what will be our strategy in this most important issue. The Barat Times go to the question of what we would have done differently. And I guess the first point is we've been calling for an Aged Care Royal Commission for quite some time, and unfortunately had to be dragged kicking and screaming, because while there are issues in particular facilities, there are real structural issues going to the operation of aged care in Australia that we have been highlighting for some time, and our colleague Julie Collins has been leading the charge in this regard. But I guess when we come to the particular issues in Victoria at the moment, it's very concerning to me and deeply wounding that the lessons that should have been learned by the issues in Sydney at Newmarch House and Dorothy Henderson Lodge do not appear to have been applied, including in terms of communication between residents and their relatives, which is a real human concern that could have been easily dealt with without costing more than a couple of cents, Jim. I hope you don't mind me saying that as the Shadow Treasurer. And I guess the last point to be made here is the role the regulator needs to be very carefully considered. We were assured in Victoria that questions had been asked and answered when it came to access to PPE and other regulatory assurance. But vulnerable Australians have not been treated well, and we have to look very carefully at this. So on that note, can I restate our commitment to look at... Oh, sorry, one more question. I thought we're at the end. Bear with me.
I might... it looks like Andrew's finding it difficult to get back on. He might have dropped out, but I know that the question is about whether or not the JobKeeper rate should be maintained at its current rate, or whether it should go down to $1,200 a fortnight per worker, as has been flagged by the government. I think it is important that the government takes another look at that reduction in the JobKeeper payment, particularly because of developments in Victoria. We will have an opportunity to engage with the Treasury this week to understand the consequences of that amount going down by $300 from the end of September. We have said for a couple of days now that the fact that Victoria has become more difficult means that the government should reconsider the announcements they made about JobKeeper almost exactly 2 weeks ago today. And so I would encourage people to monitor that. There is some prospect that the government calibrates or recalibrates that rate. We think that would be certainly worth considering, because when they tapered the JobKeeper payment away, it was based on an assumption that the situation was getting better rather than getting worse. I'll just see if there are any other questions. I might just take this as the last one. This is Il Globo, and this one is about temporary visa holders in the agriculture sector and whether the absence of workers means that there might be a price increase in fruit and vegetables. I think that remains to be seen. Certainly there are pressures on that workforce. I just spent the bulk of last week going through regional Queensland on quite a long road trip with Senator Anthony Chisholm. We drove through a lot of agricultural communities through Western Queensland, Central Queensland and the Fraser Coast. And and this is an issue that came up repeatedly, the difficulty in finding workers to do the picking in particular. We don't yet know whether that will mean an increase in prices, but we do know it's putting pressure on businesses and that we need to find a way to get the local workforces engaged with that really important task. I'll just, it doesn't appear that we have Andrew back yet, and I think we might have exhausted the questions. So can I just really thank you again for the opportunity to engage with you today. But can I most of all thank you for the way that you engage with our called communities and keep them informed in what is a really difficult time. You are doing monumentally important work that is certainly appreciated by the Federal Labor Party, Kristina Keneally, Andrew Giles, myself, Anthony Albanese, the whole team. Appreciate the work that you're doing, keeping people informed around Australia. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to talking with you again at some future point. Thanks very much.